I'll try to keep it as brief as possible since we're pressed for time. Hopefully everyone can hear me without the microphone. So I'm just going to begin with a reminder of what the general approach is for the question data bank. So I'll refer to it from now on as the Qdb Pilot, just because we have some new faces with us, which is wonderful. So one of the next big tasks that Workgroup 1 and Workgroup 2 will be undertaking is the Qdb Pilot. We've made a decision to only include national and sub-national surveys from 10 of the 35 cost action participating countries, and they are Croatia, France, Germany, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, Switzerland, and the UK. And we selected these countries because they're quite diverse geographically as well as linguistically, and they had also a lot of diversity in terms of the types of surveys that they were capturing. Just a small note for all of these countries, except for France, unfortunately, we have received the final metadata template, and we've either finished the final quality control process and have actually cleaned the template and have uploaded the information to our registry, which you'll learn more about tomorrow, or we've started the final quality control process, so we'll soon be at a stage where they'll be fully cleaned. In addition to limiting the pilot to these 10 countries, we've also decided to focus on 3 specific topics, and as a reminder, they are 1, civic and political integration, participation attitudes, social cohesion, civic engagement, social networks, and that corresponds to 2 specific variables that you find on our metadata template. The second topic is socio-physiological inclusion, which is discrimination, racism, xenophobia, as well as identity and belonging, also corresponds to a specific variable on the metadata template. And then finally, health access. Now, in terms of the actual pilot and understanding how the work is going to be approached, kind of broke it down into 3 general phases. So the first stage, we're going to be looking at the national and subnational surveys that address strictly topic 1. And we decided to do just the first topic because this is where we had a lot of expert knowledge within the cost action, and we felt that this was a strategic choice because we're already quite limited in terms of resources when it comes to doing the cost action work. By narrowing onto just topic 1, we can then identify efficient and systematic mechanisms as well as the actual technical solutions we need to implement each of the question data bank development steps. And so that would include things like, how do we actually collect the questionnaires? How do we extract the text from the questionnaires? How do we document the actual metadata at the questionnaire or the question and question item level? How do we translate the questionnaire when an English version isn't available? And then most importantly, because we've also made this decision to ensure that our Qdb can be incorporated into the SESTA Bureau question bank, how can we make sure that we're doing all this work in a way that it can easily be integrated into the EQB? The second phase then builds on the work that we do in phase 1, and we essentially expand the pilot to topic 2 and topic 3. We don't quite know yet if we want to do both of these topics together or if we will do one and then the other. It really just depends on the number of volunteers and commitments we get from our cost action. And then the objective for this phase is to really make sure that any decisions that we made during phase 1 in terms of the actual mechanism and the technical solutions for the Qdb actually make sense when you go beyond topic 1. The final phase would be to actually scale up the Qdb Pilot to include questionnaires from national and subnational surveys in all 35 cost action participating countries. I do want to note that that does not mean that we're going to be including every single survey that we've identified in the metadata work. It just means that now we're not just limiting ourselves to the 10 countries and to these topics. And then just as a reminder, all of the work that we're doing here is primarily going to be done through Workgroup 1, Workgroup 2, plus the special task force that we've created, which Natalia has generously and graciously agreed to lead. The central team at SANSPO will also be providing support, and we'll also be leveraging some RAs as well as some STSM participants that we get through the cost action. So in terms of progress, we actually haven't yet implemented the Qdb Pilot. It's still in a planning stage, but that does not mean that we haven't made any progress since our last gathering in Luxembourg. There have been a substantive number of developments, and I'm going to highlight 3 in particular. First, we actually launched a new project called Faire Ethnic Quant. It is the project that's funded by the Agence Nationale de la Recherche, the national funding agency in France. And this project has been implemented since February 2020. Why this matters for us as a cost action is because this project actually provides us with funding to cover the human resources and the technical solutions that we ultimately will need for the Qdb pilot. The second kind of big development is that we've been given access to the testing versions of Collectica Questionnaire and Collectica Designer, as well as the beta version of GESIS' Questionnaire editor. And all of this we gained access to last month. And for us, this is really important because now we're actually able to test thoroughly these different technical options we have for compiling and documenting the questionnaire and question item metadata for our Qdb before we actually launch the pilot. And the reason we have access to these particular options is because from our various conversations from individuals who are very familiar with the work involved in developing a question data bank in general, they pointed us to these resources. So once we wrap up here at this meeting, Laura and I, as well as any others who are particularly interested in the Qdb pilot, will be thoroughly testing out these different options so we really understand how they work and whether or not they are the appropriate option, at least for moving forward with the Qdb pilot. The third kind of big development is kind of the preliminary discussions we've had amongst the Work Group 1 and Work Group 2 leaders, as well as the central team at Sciences Po, about the key decisions that we really need to make before we actually even get to implementing phase 1 of the Qdb pilot. So specifically, this means talking and deciding on the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the questionnaires that will ultimately be part of our Qdb, the Qdb questionnaire and question item metadata scheme, the storage and management of the actual questionnaire, and then the general workflow for our pilot. And though preliminary discussions are still very rudimentary, it's still been a great opportunity to collect some initial feedback and reactions from the leaders, and this allows us to then expand the discussion to others who are going to be contributing to the pilot work. And actually, I'm going to focus a little bit more on this third point by walking through each of the key decisions that we really do need to act on soon because we want to get the pilot moving along fairly quickly. So in terms of the inclusion and exclusion criteria, just as a reminder, in Luxembourg, we did agree collectively that this would be one of the decisions we want to make as soon as possible. And it's really because the inclusion and exclusion criteria allows us to really understand the rules that we're going to be applying to determine which questionnaires we want to actually include or exclude from our Qdb. And we did set the deadline for this for early March 2020, which I don't know if that's still feasible, but we will try to keep that deadline in mind when working on this task. The main points of consideration in regards to the inclusion and exclusion criteria are the following. So the first one is, what kind of balance do we want to strike for the Qdb? How complete do we want it to be in relation to the post-harmonization work that we will eventually be undertaking? And here we're really thinking about 2 options. One is to collect all the questionnaires that we think are of interest or quality, or 2, to focus only on those that can effectively be used for data post-harmonization because they include a sufficient number of relevant questions. The data is collected in such a way that they are suitable for merging, and the data matrices are publicly available for the purpose of post-harmonization. Option 1 has the advantage of resulting in a more comprehensive Qdb, whereas option 2 will result in a partial Qdb, but perhaps would be a more manageable workload. So those are kind of the considerations we're thinking in regards to this point. The second main point of consideration is if we were to opt for option 1 in the previous point, then we would need to think about the following questions. Should the surveys be selected only when all data are available, or also when a data matrix exists and can potentially be obtained by demand, but may not be publicly available yet? of consideration is actually how much of the questionnaire needs to be devoted to the topic. So as you remember, we identified 3 topics that we would focus on. So we need to understand how we're going to be identifying surveys that actually belong to that topic. So in relation to that, do we actually want to establish some sort of threshold? For example, maybe looking to see if the survey has 4 to 5 questions about the topic. Or do we want to include any survey for which at least 1 question is related to that topic? I do want to highlight here that our decision for this point is dependent on point 1, because if we go for option 1 in point 1, then we could decide to add or not add a threshold, whereas if we went for option 2 from point 1, then it makes a lot more sense to actually establish a threshold because we can only meaningfully post-harmonize surveys with a reasonable amount of question items that are similar. The fourth point of consideration is thinking about whether or not we only want to consider surveys for which questionnaires are publicly available. So on the metadata template, those would be the surveys that have been marked, yes, publicly available, here is the link to access that. Or if we also want to include surveys that are available by request, perhaps because we know a specific person or entity that we can reach out to make that kind of request, or because a cost action member who was involved with compiling the metadata would be able to provide us with the link needed to access that information. Again, what we decide here has implications in terms of the time it might take to retrieve the questionnaire, and then also this decision could also be intimately linked to our decision from point 1. The final point of consideration is whether or not we want to take into account the quality rating that we had assigned, that was assigned by the person actually filling out the survey information on the metadata template, especially if this rating was actually used to assess the quality of the overall survey and not necessarily specific to the questionnaire. And then if we were to leverage this rating as a way to kind of filter out surveys that we want to include, how do we actually do that? Do we want to establish some kind of threshold? Do we want to establish different thresholds depending on the country? Because what we've noticed through the final quality control process is that different countries had actually used a very different approach to the ratings. So for example, Germany was perhaps a bit more strict with their ratings, whereas some of the other countries may have been a bit more generous and they had a lot of 9s and 10s for all the surveys. So there's some variation that came from the person encoding the template. And once again, this point also will be very much linked to our decision for point 1. I do want to mention that the 5 points that I've highlighted here, it's not necessarily an exhaustive list, but these are the main kind of points of consideration that have been brought up primarily through the Luxembourg meeting, but also in past meetings, and then more recent exchanges within the Work Group 1 and Work Group 2 leadership team. The next key decision is related to the actual metadata scheme that we'll be using for the QDB. And so what this means is actually collectively, like we've done for the survey metadata work, deciding which metadata variables we want to use to capture the questionnaire and question item level information. Because we are designing our QDB to be integrated into the EQB, we do have to take into consideration their metadata scheme, which luckily we already have had access to thanks to our colleagues at Questionnaire. So what this then means for us is thinking about how much of the EQB metadata scheme we want to apply for our own metadata scheme, and then whether or not we want to add on to or expand on the scheme that the EQB is using. And I will note here that the EQB metadata scheme is already quite comprehensive, but there might be some things that we might want to add on to. Related to this decision-making item, we have more specific kind of tasks we've identified that we need to complete. So first, to get things started, Laura and I have actually reviewed the EQB metadata scheme to understand what they are going to be capturing. We've denoted the variables that we understand as being compulsory or would be necessary to include from our cost action perspective. And then we've also identified variables that we think would be interesting to include if possible. We then have shared this kind of annotated scheme with, for the time being, the work group 1 and work group 2 leaders to collect some feedback, and then we hope to circulate this annotated scheme to other individuals at the cost action, so we can, again, collectively make a decision as to what makes sense for our QDB. And then eventually we will then be able to present a proposal of what our metadata scheme will look like so that we understand how we'll be approaching the pilot work. The next key decision is in regards to how we'll actually be storing and managing the questionnaire. And if you've participated in many of our cost action meetings, we have discussed this many times, but we actually haven't made a final decision on what makes the most sense for us. Unfortunately, the technical solutions that we're looking at for at least documenting the metadata, they don't come with kind of a questionnaire storage component, so we do have to think about alternatives. And right now, what we've thought about is using, and these are not necessarily great options, but these are the ones that at least are readily available to us, things like Google Drive, Dropbox, or some other cloud-based platform. So of course, if you have ideas or suggestions, we're open to them, and we can look into how feasible it would be for us to adopt them. And then finally, the last kind of key decision we need to make is just mapping out what the workflow would look like, even if it's at a very general level, because we need to understand all the different steps that the actual pilot will entail, so that when we're actually implementing it, we're doing it at least in a logical or pragmatic way. So, sorry if I was speaking very quickly, but I was trying to get through as succinct as possible. If you have any questions or comments about anything that I've gone through, feel free to do so. If you also need some time to digest the information, that's perfectly reasonable as well, because I did go through rather quickly a lot of information. I have added this PowerPoint into the shared Google Drive folder, so you should be able to have access to it.
We've not shared the whole drive yet,
okay.
I think. For
the day one?
For the PowerPoints. I don't think we've sent it.
No, we have